There's a solitary, humble wooden structure on a windswept hill in rural New England. To open the door is to engage our minds, our hearts, and our imaginations. In this place, preachers and professors, past and present, come alive as they walk the aisle, ascend the pulpit stairs, and teach. From theology, from history, and from the Word of God. Welcome to the Saybrook Meetinghouse, an audio production of Saybrook Ministries.
Divine Sovereignty, a sermon by David Nelson, based on Psalm 103, verse 19. The Lord hath prepared his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom ruleth over all. Published in 1827. If we had a convincing and realizing sense of God's continual and special agency in small as well as in great matters, we would be better men and better Christians. What a blessing we would feel at all times, his immediate and particular providence in the natural as well as in the moral world, guiding the motion of a planet and superintending the falling of a leaf, sweeping a nation in his anger, and directing the insect which blade of grass to ascend. Oh, this would be indeed that which we need. This would bring us to have God continually before our eyes and in all our thoughts. So immeasurably important is this doctrine that so far as we deny or forget it, in the same proportion we approach the point of atheism. And so far as we feelingly embrace it, just so far we acknowledge the existence of the invisible Creator. The fool that says in his heart, "There is no God," is by no means exclusively the man who denies the existence of the first great cause. Far from it. For, suppose we do believe and affirm that God made the worlds. If we go on to suppose that he then retired from them, leaving them to the guidance of laws implanted there, this is not the conduct or character of the God revealed to us in the Scriptures, but that of an imaginary deity that exists nowhere. And our acquaintance with the living and true God has yet to commence. Some suppose that God does interfere in great affairs or on striking occasions, but that small matters are beneath his notice. Not so the Bible. He sends the small rain upon the desert, as well as the great rain of his strength, watches the falling sparrow, feeds the young ravens when they cry, guides the clouds, and turns them about according to his counsel. In attempting to give or deepen an impression of the cardinal truth of God's minute and universal agency throughout his government, I know not, but my course may be tedious or circuitous. But could I succeed in any measure, it would well justify the most laborious process. For to be deficient in a daily and hourly sense of his presence and directorship in everything is to forget, to undeify him, or at least to deny him attributes over which he is dreadfully jealous, and at the same time deprives us of one of the purest of the Christian enjoyments, in a manner peculiarly detrimental to the soul's health and growth in grace. His kingdom ruleth over all. His providence extends to the position of every particle of dust on the face of our globe. Indeed, inasmuch as great events are made up of small incidents, without this infinitely minute attention, he could not manage any one thing in the natural world. This position stands so stark that few would venture to question it, and an attempt to illustrate it would appear almost like trifling. For let him order a storm to prostrate a certain city. Of what is the tempest composed? Minute particles of air and water. And the affair cannot be managed, or the end accomplished, unless each particle has its course marked out, its propelling power operating in a given direction, and is under the controlling superintendence of the great mover of the winds. Suppose I attempt to drive a flock of sheep to a given spot, and I am asked, do you attend to the flock as a whole merely, or does your care extend to each individual? I reply, my aim is to lodge the flock in that distant field. As for individuals, they are below my particular regard. What is the event? One passes me on the right hand, it is only an individual. Another on my left, it is but one. Another takes a wrong direction. It is too unimportant for my observance. Another strays a different course. And what becomes of the flock? They slip from beneath my regard. And I can no more dispose of them in any certain way than I could if they were in one quarter of the earth and I in another. My guardianship is a positive nullity. And so let one grain of sand pass from its maker's orders so far as to occupy a spot 1 inch distant from that he had designed for it, or let him have no designs respecting it, and where will the principle end? Another may do the same, and so the whole system of nature may glide from beneath his care. Prove that one leaf of the forest falls where he designed it not, or that he has no design respecting it, and you prove that instant that our earth is swiftly on the road to misrule and unlooked-for destruction. Take, for example, a piece of machinery no more complicated than a common watch, and the construction of a weed is 1,000 times more complex and intricate. The watch is moved by wheels and springs. The wheels have on them small protuberances called by artists cogs. Suppose on the side of these he observes a small portion of metal more than on the rest. He says, the cog is itself so small I can scarcely see it, and it requires a glass to remark any difference in size. It is trifling. I will let it alone. But mark the result. When the machine is put in motion, this minute difference causes an irregularity of movement, throwing an unequal pressure on different parts, and that unequal pressure wears unequally. The further the evil proceeds, the faster it progresses, and total disorganization is the speedy consequence of this trifling inequality. Now there is a constant interchange and mutual operation of element on element around us. Earth becoming vegetables, and vegetables becoming earth, air becoming water, and water becoming air. And if but one particle of any of these were to escape the specific guidance of the mighty ruler, its tendency would be to drag others after it, and these others, and so on to the ruin of the whole. These things some may be too indolent or too uninformed to notice, others too proud or too fearful of the natural interference to concede. But well for us is it that his kingdom ruleth over all. What is the inference? In the same way must he rule over the minutiae of his moral government. Otherwise, no great end could be conducted to any certain result. Imagine, for the sake of illustration, an ungodly young man walking into a house after a fatiguing morning excursion. He throws himself into the first chair he sees, near which stands a table, on which a book is laid. For want of other employment, he opens the volume, and the word eternity meets his eye. This thought pushes him to glance at an expected state of existence which never ends. The deeper he thinks, the more he is startled into the necessity to think deeper. And, not to be tedious in tracing the various exercises of his mind and heart, it ends in his hearty submission to the Lord Jesus Christ. Here is a soul saved from utter death. Now, few are the Christians, I imagine, who could cordially assert, without any misgivings, that chance conducted that affair, that immortal soul's salvation depended on the management of a blind non-entity. For who is chance? Where does he reside? What agents does he employ in bringing about such glorious results? But if chance was not the personage of intelligence and activity who accomplished the happy business, then it was Israel's God who did it. And if he designed that on that memorable morning the word eternity, in capital letters, should meet the eye of that favored one, and be instrumental in bringing an immortal soul into the ark of safety, then, mark you, what countless myriads of small providences must all be managed so as to converge and concenter at that important crisis. Before the book could be read, it must be printed. This calls for an artist, and he must be provided with strength and sustenance and intellect sufficient to accomplish it. The paper, too, must be made by one who is not to be cut off by an apoplectic stroke before the work is finished. The chair must stand where it did. The book was laid there, and not on the shelf, by a hand that knew not wherefore, but God knew. The table had its fabricator, and a train of providences, from Adam down to him, must be moved by an unerring hand. Or he might not have lived, or might not have lived at the proper time, or might not have possessed the necessary skill or the necessary implements. It is in vain to say that if the printer or the joiner had died before the book was made, God could easily have ordered another to be substituted, for the same guardian providences must have been exercised in the production of that other book at the proper time and place. The table once grew in the form of a tree in the forest, but not an insect in the woods must be allowed to destroy it from the time it shot from the acorn. In short, the train is endless. And if any of these apparently little things had failed, the whole result would have been changed. But there was not the slightest danger, for he hath prepared his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom ruleth over all. But how is it with regard to the vicious and unprincipled transactions of nations and of men? His wonderful kingdom rules there also, man's criminality consisting in his evil intention. I know of no code of laws in any civilized nation that will sentence a man for an act he did not intend, which he performed against his will, or which was undertaken from pure motives. We are informed God sent Joseph into Egypt for the purposes of saving life. His brethren, who sold him, intended no such thing. If I, in leaping to save one from drowning, unfortunately push him further into the current, I am doing a praiseworthy act. If I pushed him there with the intent he might perish, I am a murderer. God sent Nebuchadnezzar to scourge Jerusalem. Why then did he positively punish the Assyrian king for that very act? Isaiah 10, verses 5, 6, 7, and 12. O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in their hand is mine indignation. I will send him against an hypocritical nation, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge, to take the spoil, and to take the prey, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. Howbeit, He meaneth not so, neither doth his heart think so. But it is in his heart to destroy and cut off nations, not a few. Wherefore it shall come to pass, that when the Lord hath performed his whole work upon Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, I will punish the fruit of the stout heart of the king of Assyria, and the glory of his high looks. Let us notice some of the past transactions of the world we inhabit. Cambyses, son of the famous Cyrus, and second absolute ruler of the great empire of the Persians, proceeded in profligacy, rapaciousness, and every imaginable enormity, as far perhaps as unlimited authority, vast wealth, and total depravity could push a son of Adam. About this time, Egypt, idolatrous, groveling, contemptible Egypt, had sunk so low in bestial practices that the pure rays of the sun were no longer allowed to look upon her filthiness. Who was to scourge her? God sent Cambyses to perform that work. Cambyses' object was pride or plunder. He moved his thousands on, poured destruction through the city of the Nile, and dashed her little ones against the stones. And now the labor performed, what is to become of the actors? Are they to burden earth's surface longer? Very little. A rich temple just across the Libyan desert tempts their avarice, and thitherward they march. One division is overtaken by famine, and it were tedious to tell the shocking distress that wasted them. The other was buried alive in those sand winds of Africa, which raised the surface of the desert and let it fall again, so as to form mountains in a few hours, where before there was a perfect plain. Now contemplate them, looking with horror at the approaching ruin. Moving in air, the dreadful sand spouts whirl. Here are 50,000 wretches that are never again to stab the defenseless for the sake of the ornaments they wear. Long ranks in vain the shining blade extend, to demon gods their knees unhallowed bend, pierce the deaf tempest with lamenting cries, press their parched lips, and close their bloodshot eyes. On and still on, the dreadful column swims, bursts o'er their heads, inhumes their struggling limbs. Man mounts on camels, camels rush, hosts march o'er hosts, and thousands crush. Wheeling in air, the flinty islands fall, and one vast earthy ocean covers all. Then ceased the storm. Night stooped her Ethiop brow to earth, and listened to the groans below. Grim horror shook. Awhile the living hill heaved with convulsive throes, and all was still. There is a majesty, oftentimes, in heaven's method to rid the earth of overgrown guilt, which reconciles the mind to the dreadful event. We might commence with the history of the world, and trace it from Nimrod's conquest down to the present day, and see the same chain of providences with regard to every independent nation that has ever existed. When they became vicious to a certain extent, they were scourged or annihilated, as the case required, and the instruments of correction afterwards, when they needed it, were scourged or deservedly destroyed. But detail is not practicable. Let us approach at once the transactions of modern days. See the sons of Spain, with gold for their object, and religion for their pretext, sail to the west, and slaughter 1 million of unarmed South Americans. It is true that the depravity, the idolatry, and the disgusting practices of the Peruvians rendered them the object of heaven's frown, or they would not have suffered such things. But this does not affect the conduct of the invaders. They would have acted as they did, had the moral character of that people been spotless as the snow robe of their own tall Andes. Spain's cruelties on that occasion were, briefly, such as never were before recorded in history. And is she to escape? No. The vial of wrath speedily commenced, and still continues pouring upon her, without mixture or cessation. Napoleon of France, the great demagogue of recent Europe, sent his infidel cohorts there, and the long, long ravage continued until many of her populous towns were fit habitation for the wild beasts of the desert. But did the self-made European and his plundering divisions know they were performing the work of retribution? Far from it. He meant not so, neither did his heart think so. But his object was to destroy and to put down nations, not a few. Therefore, the magazines of Russian snows were preparing to embrace the stiff limbs of his depraved legions, and his own grave was already marked out in the rocks of St. Helena. Did not Russia need a scourge? She did, although it was not to proceed to entire overthrow. But the time of the invaders was come. Here were 300,000 infidels whose race of iniquity was run, who had heard for the last time in the sacked city the shriek of innocence and the groan of death mingle with the rush of the conflagration. Now their own last and horrid imprecations are to mix with the infuriated shout of the vengeful Cossack, and press heavily on their death-rending ears. And what is to become of England for grinding India with unmitigated cruelty, as she has done, and is still doing? The gospel will be advanced thereby, and God is thus pouring out his fury upon the heathen. But woe to the wicked instrument! 'Tis only the salt of the righteous few who inhabit Britain, which has preserved her so long. But let us not pass unnoticed the kind providences of God in the affairs of our own favored country, pending the revolutionary struggle, when the singular spectacle was presented of an infant colony, in need of everything, a nation from whose ports, when her navy spread the canvas to ocean's breeze, surrounding kingdoms, old in arts and arms, trembled in expectation where the storm would burst. In this struggle, when the invading army, victorious in one great conflict, was about to force to a second general engagement our broken regiments, which would most likely have proved annihilation to them, if not to the cause they supported, what presented? One day and nights, unceasing rain. When another leader had paved the way for provisional supplies and consequent active movements, what prevented his destructive march? The torrents of heaven furrowed the roads until transportation was impracticable, and by this delay, surrounding troops pressed in and forced to capitulation the whole of his marauding band. At Yorktown, just before the final blow was struck, when the trench-encircled Britons had devised a plan of escape, what providence forbade it? A night storm drove their boats to ruin. These are but the alphabet of details which the historian gives us. And do you inquire, what use would you make of them? Simply this: if God is the author of our liberties, let us thank him for it, and let us thank him for it. The worthy men who led our armies were only rods in the hands of the smiter. And shall we pay homage to the staff or the sword wielded in our defense, and never see the arm that sweeps it? If we do, such stupid idolatry cannot pass unnoticed. When the praiseworthy Frenchman lately visited our shores, when thousands and millions crowded to speak to look upon him, beset his way for hundreds of miles with naked heads, and business thrown aside, with triumphal arches, shouts of joy and songs of praise, and with everything which could testify gratitude, because he had fought in their behalf, how must the leader of the upper army have looked upon this? He knew that he had made Lafayette, had given him wealth to use for us, opportunity and intellect to act, had excited him to do all that he did, and was, in short, the whole and sole author of all our blessings, but never had received from those shouting millions during the whole course of their lives 1/10 part of the gratitude, respect, and adoration bestowed on the French stranger in 1 hour. He also had lost his blood freely once on our behalf. But in the estimation of the multitude, the Redeemer bears no comparison with the nation's guest. May the God of compassion, from whom we have received everything, have mercy upon the stupidity of our wise men and the ignorance of our men of greatness. But again, by one act of his providence, he who has prepared his throne in the heavens accomplishes a great variety of objects. Suppose a wealthy and wicked man to live under a government where the church is much oppressed by an unrighteous monarch. Suppose him to have an amiable wife, a pious and only son. Now let the despotic king, merely through dislike to the father, throw into prison this youth of piety and promise, where he shortly dies. What may the death of that one individual accomplish in the plan of him whose kingdom ruleth over all? God takes him from an evil world and from the distresses before him, and translates him to perfect joy and boundless glory. A happy exchange. But what does it accomplish with regard to the mother? She who was before lukewarm in religion, having her affections divided between earth and heaven, is thus made to grow in grace and to prepare rapidly for the change of death before her. How with the father, wicked and afflicted? He is brought to reflect on the nothingness of earthly things. In this way, when nothing else could have driven him to reflection, and thus is prepared to have his son's company in eternity, when they must otherwise have been forever divided. With the king, it is a providence of retribution. The indignation of a whole people is roused by the flagrancy of the act. They push him from the pedestal of power, and thus is the church liberated, the nation freed, the monarch trodden down, the mother reclaimed, the father saved, the son glorified. Thus are all events coupled together by an invisible chain. Each opening leaf and every stroke fulfills some deep design. And not only one, but countless deep designs. Let the converted father we have been speaking of turn the stream of his wealth and the arm of his influence against Satan's kingdom in the world. And let those converted through his instrumentality exercise their moral influence on the next widest circle. And how many songs from ransomed souls will swell forever in praise to God that that youth was made to die in jail, and that that wicked monarch ever lived and acted forth the feelings of his voluntary depravity. How much enjoyment does the Christian lose who thinks his kingdom ruleth over but a part? And who cannot say with full consent of soul, let his throne be fixed high in the heavens, and let us rejoice that his kingdom ruleth over all. In conclusion, throughout all the changes that have ever happened among men, the exaltation of kingdoms or the depression of nations, God's object has been his church. This sounds singular in the ears of those who do not know why the worlds were made, but it is none the less true. Did the prosperity of his church require that the Israelites should be slaves? There was a nation ready to hold them in bondage, and thither they were conducted. Did their deliverance demand the overthrow of that nation's strength? Angels and elements stood ready to perform the work. Did the promised land all this time require inhabitants to subdue wild beasts, plant vineyards, and dig for water? The Canaanites performed that labor, and just at the time the country was needed, the cup of their iniquity began to run over, and the work of extermination at once sent them to their long account, and gave the land in a tillable condition into the hands of its long-destined owners. Did the health of the church again require she should be scourged in captivity? Nebuchadnezzar and his Chaldeans were made powerful enough to do it, but paid dearly for being the wicked instruments. Were their release and another temple necessary? Cyrus, the Persian leader, is made strong enough to overturn the many-gated city and release the Jews, wealthy enough to rebuild Jerusalem, and suddenly willing enough to do both, although he knew not the only true God. In this way, we might begin with the commencement of history and end with the present moment, showing that all the actions of mortals have their prime bearing on the Church of Christ, whether they know it and wish it or not. Irreligious men in office, those who administer government, kings, statesmen, legislators, have rarely been God's children, have rarely been his friends, and if so, he looks upon them as the least of mankind. They often fancy that free institutions or other great national blessings are designed for the dignity, the comfort, or the glory of such as they are, or for the happiness of the people at large. But they are not so important in the view of higher beings as in their own eyes. Little do they dream that they would scarcely be noticed, except for punishment, were it not for the church. That the principal use omnipotence has for their greatness is this: the superior hand has his hook in their nose and his bridle in their jaws, and is leading them about when and where he pleases, to do the business of these unknown few, the meek and contrite. Little do they dream that notwithstanding their great exploits, shining talents, and incessant parade about patriotism and virtue, there is more safety to the nation's prosperity in the circumstance of the little flock being interspersed through the land than in all the cannon-mounted ramparts on the beach. For his throne is prepared in the heavens, and it is his kingdom that ruleth over all. Amen.
Thank you for joining us this week at the Saybrook Meetinghouse. We hope you've been blessed by today's podcast. Saybrook Ministries' mission is to provide didactic and devotional content from the Christian faith delivered to the saints, recovered and refined by the Protestant Reformation. Be sure to visit saybrookministries.org, as well as our Facebook and Twitter pages, for continually updated Christian content designed to inspire and invigorate our imagination and intellect. Join us next week for another journey to the Saybrook Meetinghouse. Until then, may God bless you.